Hi, I'm Greg Dell here with Cesar Gavidia, and today we're going to talk about a real common issue that we're seeing and that we've seen a ton over the last 10 years dealing with total versus residual disability. And usually we only see this analysis come about in the private disability insurance policies, not so much in the ERISA group policies, although sometimes you can have a partial versus total claim. And usually a lot of the total versus residual, also known as partial disability claims that we see, come about for physicians primarily.
Right.
So, Cesar, I know recently in preparation for a national lecture that you and I will be doing coming up soon, you researched a bunch of cases to discuss this issue, but for our purposes and to make this topic pretty basic for someone who's watching this video, let's first establish the two different types of definition of disability that we're talking about, and then we'll use an example of a particular occupation, like maybe an interventional cardiologist or an interventional radiologist, to explain how it could affect that particular person. So let's start with the two types of definitions of disability that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and basically those are the most common definitions of disability that we see in the individual disability policies, which is total disability versus residual disability, and the term of own occupation. Okay, and total disability in these policies are often defined as your inability to perform the substantial material duties of your own occupation, while partial or residual disability is defined as being unable to perform one or more of the substantial and material duties of your own occupation. And then they throw an income qualifier in there, which basically says that in order to qualify, you have to have at least a 20% loss of earnings. So those are the two most common definitions or terms that we find when doing that analysis.
Right, and so the conflict and the challenge that always comes in these claims is often you have a carrier who says, we don't think you're total, we think you're residual, because you can do one of the duties, whereas if you have 5 particular major duties in your occupation and you can't do 4 of them, but you can do one of them, then they say you're residual,
right,
not total. So
right.
let's talk about a case that you recently read and how that applied and what the court did in that situation. So if you can give us the factual background and then...
Well, I'll give you, there's a case actually in our home circuit here of the 11th Circuit where Florida is, that was actually a Georgia case originally. And it went through the course of going to trial and going through motions and all of that, and then it finally ended up many years later in the appellate court at the 11th Circuit. And it was there mainly on this issue, on the issue of total versus residual disability. And the case is called Giddens versus Equitable. And Dr. Giddens was formerly a dentist. He'd given up his practice, actually, interestingly, about 4 years before he claimed disability. And at the time he claimed disability, he was claiming it as a dentist and as a real estate developer. One of the issues before the court in that case was, well, what was his occupation? He was arguing that, well, my occupation is both dentist and real estate developer. On that issue, the court said no. It's very clear. There's no ambiguity here with respect to that. The question of whether you're a dentist and a real estate developer, you were not performing the material duties of a dentist at the time that you became disabled. You had voluntarily, or I guess you could say you had given up those duties in that occupation years before. So the question here is simply, are you disabled or totally disabled or partially disabled from being a real estate developer? And the court went through an analysis of whether he was totally or partially disabled from being a real estate developer, and Equitable was, of course, arguing, well, if he could perform any of the duties of his occupation, then at best he's residually or partially disabled. He's I guess, able to earn some income there, whether depending on what his income is, he would qualify for a percentage of his benefit. And since he's able to perform one or more, he's partially disabled. Dr. Giddens was arguing that it really didn't matter if he was able to perform one or more. It really goes to the quality of that work that he's performing and the ability to, I guess, really provide quality type of work in that occupation, and in a way almost participate in that occupation with some continuity, right? And the court actually agreed with him in that case, where they said, look, it does come down to the quality of your occupation. To essentially work and not be able to earn any income in that occupation, that in and of itself isn't gonna mean you're partially disabled. That could mean you're totally disabled, and that's what the court ruled there.
So, Cesar, let's talk about an example like we said earlier. We would talk about like an interventional cardiologist.
Sure.
So we've had so many cases where potential client calls us and says, look, carrier's telling me I'm residual, I'm telling them I'm total, and well, what's your occupation? I'm an interventional cardiologist. Okay, well, how often are you in the cath lab?
Right.
How much of your work is interventional cardiology, or are you running a cardiac practice?
Mm-hmm.
So first thing off, it's not about what you call yourself. You might call yourself interventional cardiologist. The title doesn't matter. It's all about what your CPT productions and your OR or cath lab stats are going to show. So you've had the scenario where the person says, I'm an interventional cardiologist, and they do 2 procedures a week, make 15% of their revenue from CAT procedures, and the other 85% is from office visits.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's probably that's a residual person, because they're not really truly an interventional cardiologist, as opposed to the person who makes 75% of their revenue doing interventional cardiology, CAT procedures. The other 25% is incidental to going into the to be evaluated to see whether or not they need a catheterization.
Right.
So, but where is that line?
So there's a big gray area, because in the scenarios you just talked about, that's almost like the no-brainer, the easy scenario to figure out. So what happens when 50% of their procedures are interventional procedures,
right,
while 50% are office visits? But then, say 25% of those office visits or that clinical work is incidental to the interventional, or maybe even a greater percentage.
Right.
And then the other, let's say half of that is, general cardiology or whatever. So it makes up for like 10 to 15% as being general cardiology. Now, certainly you can't expect that if that doctor changes his practice completely, that he's not going to make some profit. And the insurance company's probably going to have a very hard time that if that paying that doctor total, if he changes essentially his occupation from interventional to general cardiologist and continues making a substantial profit from that. But that still could possibly mean that that doctor, that interventional cardiologist, was indeed totally disabled. Doesn't matter that he changed his practice after he became disabled, and prior to disability, 10 to 15% of his duties were, general cardiology. Based on the language of the policy, at the time he was disabled, the substantial material duties of his occupation were interventional cardiology. Were interventional cardiology with, let's say 25% office visits or clinical that were incidental to interventional cardiology. So it's a very complex analysis sometimes. That's why the CPT code production and the CAT labs, the CAT lab data is important, because you're there to prove your case. And the case law is very clear. I mean, the burden's always on the insured, or in this case, the interventional cardiologist, to prove his disability, to prove whether they're totally disabled versus partially disabled. So we do find those gray areas. Those are areas that are highly contested. We've seen case after case after case litigated over that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that gray area comes up for the interventional radiologist, the same thing about the radiology procedures, and it comes up for the dentist who stops doing the crown and bridge and the extractions and is just doing, general oral exams. It comes up for the general surgeon, and we've tried those cases. We've taken that case to verdict before, where you're a general surgeon, but then you're only doing some endoscopy procedures, but you're not cutting the skin anymore. So are you total or residual? So every single one of these cases, the key is it's very fact specific, and you have to be prepared to produce the data, mostly being the CPT codes or ADA codes or surgical records or hospital reports. A lot of the hospitals,
and billing.
And billing as well. And a lot of the hospitals track how many surgeries you've done and things like that. So, that's where we work with you and work with our experts to be able to present this evidence in a manner that will really show what you were doing, and so that we can explain to the disability carrier as to why you are total. The other thing that sometimes happens is they may spend 50% of their time doing something, a particular duty, but it's 90% of their revenue.
Right.
So what do you do in that situation? Because then they say, well, you can do what you're doing the other 50% of the time, but you're only going to generate 10% of what you're going to do. So where does the real line of practically speaking saying, okay, yeah, I can do that one duty, but it pays 10% of what I was doing, so there's no way I can make a living doing that.
Right, and I think that's why court after court has taken the view that it's a qualitative type of analysis that's applied. Okay, it just simply because they continue to work and they continue to perform some of the duties of their occupation at the time they became disabled, that does not necessarily mean that they're partially or residually disabled. They could be totally disabled.
Right. Okay, so if you are, if you have one of these policies and you're considering whether or not you're total or residual, there's very often people call us and they think they're residual, and we look at it and go, no, we think you've been total for years and we're not being evaluated properly. Or you may still be working and not truly understand your options in terms of becoming disabled and knowing whether or not you're total or residual. So give us a call. We're happy to review your policy, review the status of your claim, give you a free consultation, opinion as to whether or not we think we can help you, and we'll let you know very quickly what we can do for you.